Let's look at summary, paraphrase, and quotation practices in scholarly articles across the disciplines and see how they vary. First, remember the basic differences among these terms. Quotation uses direct language from the original source without changing it. Paraphrase uses different language from the original source and does not condense the length. Summary uses different language from the original source and condenses the length by half or more. This is an article about a novel by Edgar Allan Poe. It is typical of a research article in literature and the humanities more generally because in addition to summary and paraphrase, it has a lot of quotations of direct wording from sources. This makes sense when you consider that in literary criticism, words are the data being analyzed. Most of these quotations function as exhibits in Joe Bissup's beam terminology, and the direct wording is necessary for the analysis to be specific and effective. Okay, I've marked a section at the bottom of this page, that uses summary. The writer is describing the focus of a large chunk of a chapter in a few sentences, not using any direct wording from the original text. This summary is used in the analysis as is an example of an exhibit in Bissup's terms. In contrast, a little bit. In contrast to the summary, this section marked at the top of the page here does use direct quotation. Some of the quotations are a couple of sentences long, and others are just short phrases like phantom of an idea. The quotation marks show what is the direct wording. These are also examples of evidence from the text functioning as an exhibit for analysis. And here, this section in the middle of the page is set apart in a block and indented. It is called a block quotation. It is direct wording as indicated by the indentation, which takes the place of quotation marks. Occasionally, I've seen a journal that indents block quotations and uses quotation marks, but that's rare in my experience. Okay, let's move onward a bit to some other examples in this same article. And here we see the writer of this article quoting from another scholar's article who was quoting from the novel. The writer puts double quotation marks around around what he has taken from the article that he quoted, and then single quotation marks within that show the language that came directly from that novel that this other critic originally quoted. So that single quotation marks show what was in quotation marks in this critic's article. Also, the writer quotes from this scholar, putting her words in direct quotation marks here that came from the article, then goes on to paraphrase some of her ideas from that same article without using direct language, and so not putting anything in quotation marks in that second part. Okay. The scholarly language that's quoted, in contrast to the words from the novel that were used primarily as exhibits, are used to engage in arguments with the other scholars as the writer goes on to agree with their interpretations and extend them. These examples of summary, quotation, and paraphrase that I've looked at here are fairly representative of how sources are used in the humanities. Most are taken up as exhibits to analyze or as arguments to engage with. The literary sources are most frequently the exhibits, and the other critics' sources more usually engaged with as argument. Now we're going to shift to an article from Psychology, which demonstrates social science research, and some areas of psychology really do share some of the conventions of hard science research. So this is going to be pretty different from some of the ways sources are incorporated in articles in the humanities. Unlike typical research in the humanities, the words here are not the data that get analyzed. Instead, these researchers are analyzing responses to an experiment. In this case, it involved answers to a survey about procrastination, and these answers to this survey can be expressed numerically. This article has very few quotations compared to the literary study we just looked at, and no long or block quotations at all. But compared to some articles in the sciences and social sciences that are completely devoid of quotations, this one stands out, perhaps demonstrating some personal preference of the authors within the range of variation in the field, or showing that social sciences generally have a little more quotation than hard sciences, but a lot less than the humanities. Okay, let's look here. This article is begun with a short quotation or an epigraph that forecasts the theme of the article, but it's not formally introduced. You see nothing, no signal phrases, according to. It's just left there for the reader to infer that this quotation connects to the main ideas of this piece. Okay, fairly not really common that you see it in the social sciences. The article begins with a summary of a trend across several research studies. So the work cites several studies and generalizes about it, summarizes. Okay. Then it paraphrases some findings in a particular study in a little more detail. Okay. We'll go on just a little. All right, in this example, we see some paraphrase from a study. Okay, direct wording is not used, and so quotation marks are not used. And this is some background and information that is used in this article. Okay. Here is one of only 3 direct quotations, including that epigraph at the beginning, of language from other sources in this article, other than items that appear in the survey form. This 19-page article does have a few quotations, but many, many fewer than we saw in the literary article. Okay, and this one is an important concept that they are emphasizing as a call for further research on active procrastination, which they are answering in this article that they've written. So that this was an important enough concept that they wanted to use the writer's direct words here for emphasis. Okay. Let's move just a little on into the methods section, and we see where the most direct quotation in this article appears. They have borrowed from other scholars' surveys about procrastination and used some direct wording in quotation marks to show the items on the survey that they've taken directly. Okay, so this 8 quotation marks within this article show direct wording that appeared on the survey instrument. So this is functioning as method in Bishop's terminology. Okay. The preference for summary or paraphrase over quotation in the sciences and social sciences becomes clear when we compare the rates of these ways of referring to sources in the two articles. This psychology article had 33 articles cited in the reference section. We'll skip to that really quickly to show you some of them. Okay, so several pages of sources, including 33 articles. Those articles were cited 82 times within the text. 74 of those citations in the text, or 90%, used summary or paraphrase, while 8 of those citations, or 10%, were for direct quotations. If you don't count the 5 direct quotations of phrases in the survey, which is particular to this kind of research and not something you'd find in every study, only 4% of the references to sources in this psychology article included direct quotation. I didn't count all of the sources, the citations in the Pym article about Poe's novel, but there were 71 endnotes to sources and many more in-text references to passages within the novel. On 10 pages of this 24-page article, I counted the quotations and found an average of 9 quotations per page, one more than the 8 quotations found in the entire 19-page psychology article. These differences are fairly typical of what you'll see in articles within the humanities versus the sciences or social sciences. So keep this preference in mind as you do your research and pay attention to what is common in your field. Going to show you the results. Since I just looked at 2 articles here in detail, I want to show you the results from a very large study of thousands of texts in many different disciplines by Ken Hyland. He uses a computer program to find patterns about language use within articles, and so he was able to put together some pretty big generalizations about patterns that show up in several disciplines based on these thousands of articles. And he included works from biology, electronic engineering, physics, mechanical engineering, marketing, applied linguistics, sociology, and philosophy. And he shows here the percentage of citations represented in these different forms. So you can see that quotation, whether shorter quotations or block quotations, are just not used in the science articles that he looked at. Biology, electronic engineering, physics, and mechanical engineering had no examples of quotations whatsoever. Marketing, applied linguistics, and sociology and philosophy had some, but you're still looking at under 10% of the cited material in the form of quotations, and for some of these fields a good bit under 10%. I think had he looked at humanities fields like English and history, he probably would have found a higher rate of quotation. But you certainly get a sense that the use of summary and paraphrase and generalization, which is an even less specific mention of material from that article, are modes that are used much, much more frequently in these fields than direct quotation. So as you're thinking about how to represent sources in your research writing, realize that scholars don't use quotation most often, and that if you're not in a field that really favors direct quotation from sources like history or English, you're probably going to need to get familiar with summary and paraphrase as the way that you render information from most of your sources. If you're in some of the sciences, you definitely will need to drop your dependence on quotation if you have one. Okay, just some things to keep in mind.